The story of Nehemiah is one of the most inspiring in the Old Testament. He was neither a priest nor a prophet, but a simple cupbearer who played a key role in the restoration of Jerusalem. Its story is recorded in the book of Nehemiah, which is a direct continuation of the book of Ezra, and both narrate the return of the exiled Jews from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple, and the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was the son of Hakaliah, and his lineage connects him to the Jews who returned from exile to rebuild their homeland. Although the Bible does not go into extensive detail about his genealogy, it highlights his connection to the people and spiritual heritage of Israel. More than a matter of blood, his connection with the exiled Jews was a matter of faith and identity. His name, Nehemiah, has a deep meaning, comforted by Yahweh or God comforts. This reflects the central theme of his life, being a channel of comfort and restoration for his people in a time of great distress. This name was not just an identification, but a constant reminder of his divine mission. The story of Nehemiah is set during Persian rule in the 5th century BC, a time when the Persian Empire ruled vast territories, including Judah and Jerusalem. The return of the exiles had begun years earlier under Cyrus the Great's decree, allowing the Jews to return to their land to rebuild the temple. However, the city walls remained in ruins, leaving Jerusalem vulnerable and its inhabitants unprotected. Before becoming a recognized leader in the reconstruction of Jerusalem, Nehemiah performed a seemingly simple but extremely important role. He was cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, monarch of the powerful Persian Empire. Although the title may suggest a trivial task, the position of cupbearer went far beyond just serving wine. The position of cupbearer was synonymous with absolute trust. Nehemiah was responsible for ensuring that the king's food and drink were free from poisoning, a common thread in political circles at the time. This meant he had direct and frequent access to the monarch, a privilege reserved for a few. More than a servant, Nehemiah was a close advisor. His constant presence at the king's side enabled a coexistence that offered him insights into the challenges of the government and the political dynamics of the court. This experience was crucial in shaping the wisdom and leadership that Nehemiah would later demonstrate. Nehemiah's position was not only one of service, but also one of learning. He witnessed diplomatic negotiations, dealt with the complexities of administering a vast empire, and observed the impact of royal decisions. This constant contact with power gave Nehemiah a practical understanding of leadership strategies and planning, skills that would be essential in his mission. Furthermore, his proximity to Artaxerxes was one of the factors that enabled the king's future support for the reconstruction of Jerusalem. The relationship of trust built over time opened the door for Nehemiah to ask permission and help directly from the monarch. In the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire was one of the greatest powers in the world, ruling a vast territorial extension that included the region of Judah and Jerusalem. Although the empire granted a certain cultural and religious autonomy to its provinces, many cities, including Jerusalem, were still in ruins after the Babylonian invasions. This destruction represented not only a structural problem, but also a wound in the identity of the Jewish people. The role of cupbearer was not accidental. Nehemiah was being quietly prepared for a greater calling. God strategically positioned him where he could acquire the skills needed to lead and rebuild, while keeping him connected to the needs of his people. This chapter in Nehemiah's life reminds us that often the roles we play, however modest they may seem, are part of a greater plan. Nehemiah demonstrated how faithfulness in the small can open doors to greater and impactful achievements. In the next topic, we will explore how the news about Jerusalem completely changed Nehemiah's life and placed him at the center of a divine plan. Nehemiah lived a comfortable life in King Artaxerxes' palace, surrounded by the luxury and security of the Persian court. However, an unexpected visit completely changed the course of his life. The news that Nehemiah received about the state of Jerusalem brought to the surface a deep sense of sadness and an urgent call to action. It all started when Nehemiah, in his role at the palace, encountered a group of visitors from Judah. Curious and concerned, he asked about the situation of the people who had returned from exile and about the state of Jerusalem. The response was devastating. According to Nehemiah 1 verse 3, Those who survive captivity are there in the province experiencing great suffering and humiliation. The walls of Jerusalem were broken down, and its gates were burned with fire. This news revealed the deplorable state of Jerusalem. Without walls, the city was vulnerable to attacks, and its inhabitants lived under constant threat, unprotected and demoralized. Jerusalem, which symbolized the identity, faith, and heritage of the Jewish people, was in complete desolation. Upon hearing these words, Nehemiah was overcome with deep sadness. In Nehemiah 1 verse 4 he describes his reaction. "When I heard these things, I sat down and cried. I spent days mourning, fasting, and praying to the God of heaven." This moment demonstrates Nehemiah's sensitivity to the suffering of his people. Even though he is physically distant, he did not ignore the problem or seek solace in his privileged position. Instead, he allowed the pain to move him to seek answers and solutions. Nehemiah understood that the desolation of Jerusalem was not just a political or structural problem. For him, it was a spiritual issue. The ruin of the walls represented the separation of God's people, the breaking of a covenant. Nehemiah knew that restoration needed to begin with reconnection with God, and his first response was to seek divine guidance. Nehemiah saw a personal calling in the Jerusalem crisis. He could have chosen to ignore the news, but his compassion and faith led him to see beyond the problem. He realized that God was giving him an opportunity to make a difference. This news not only broke Nehemiah's heart, but it also shaped him for the mission that lay ahead. Sadness was turned into fuel for a greater purpose. Nehemiah did not allow himself to be paralyzed by pain. He chose to act. This crucial moment in Nehemiah's life teaches us that often, the difficulties we face are the beginning of something transformative. Faced with the devastation of Jerusalem and the pain caused by the news, Nehemiah found his strength in prayer. This moment of spiritual quest was the foundation for everything he would accomplish next. Instead of acting impulsively, Nehemiah began his journey of reconstruction at the feet of God with a prayer that exemplifies humility, confession, and trust in divine power. After hearing about the ruin of Jerusalem, Nehemiah immediately sought refuge in prayer and fasting. Nehemiah 1 verse 4 says, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. I spent days mourning, fasting, and praying to the God of heaven." This stance demonstrates the essence of Nehemiah's leadership, a leader who placed God at the center of his decisions. He recognized that the challenge he faced was greater than his own strength and therefore needed divine guidance. Nehemiah's prayer, recorded in Nehemiah 1 verses 5 to 11, is a powerful model for how to seek God in times of crisis. It can be divided into 4 main parts. Nehemiah begins his prayer by extolling the character of God. "Lord, God of heaven, great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and kindness to those who love you and obey your commandments." Here, Nehemiah recognizes God's faithfulness and reaffirms his trust in his power. Nehemiah not only confesses the people's sins, but also takes personal responsibility. "I confess the sins that we, the Israelites, have committed against you. Yes, I and my people have sinned." He understands that the state of Jerusalem was a consequence of collective disobedience and humbly calls for forgiveness. Nehemiah reminds God of the promises made to Moses, showing that he knew the scriptures and trusted in divine covenants. "If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, I will bring you together again." This part of the prayer demonstrates that Nehemiah based his hope on God's unchanging promises. Finally, Nehemiah presents his request clearly and directly. "Give me success today by granting me grace before this man." He refers to King Artaxerxes, recognizing that he would need the monarch's approval and support to act. Nehemiah's prayer was more than a simple act of devotion. It was a moment of spiritual alignment. He sought clarity, courage, and wisdom directly from God, showing that his leadership was guided by sound spiritual principles. Nehemiah did not use prayer as an excuse for inaction. He knew that praying was the first step, but not the only one. Your fellowship with God has equipped you to act with purpose and courage. This teaches us that when we face challenges, prayer should be our first response, preparing us to act effectively and with direction. After days of prayer, fasting, and reflection, Nehemiah was convinced that he needed to act. However, the next step was extremely risky. He would have to present his request directly to King Artaxerxes, the most powerful monarch of his time. This situation required not only courage, but also wisdom and faith. Nehemiah knew that any mistake could cost him his life. Showing sadness or dissatisfaction in the king's presence was considered an affront, as the Persian court valued an atmosphere of harmony and joy. Nehemiah 2 verses 1-2 describes the moment. Never before had I been sad in his presence. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad if you are not sick?" This sadness can only be from the heart. This direct question put Nehemiah in a delicate position. He knew he was being watched closely and that his response could determine the course of his mission. Despite his fear, Nehemiah responded respectfully and sincerely. "May the king live forever. How could my face not be sad if the city where the tombs of my fathers are is in ruins, and its gates were destroyed by fire?" This response not only explained his sadness, but also evoked empathy by highlighting the familial and cultural ties that connected him to Jerusalem. Nehemiah showed wisdom by approaching the issue emotionally, but without directly accusing or confronting the king. Surprisingly, the king not only listened, but also asked, "What would you like to order?" Nehemiah, before responding, said a silent prayer to God. "Then I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king." Nehemiah asked for permission to return to Jerusalem and lead the rebuilding of the city. He did not hesitate to detail his needs, showing preparation and clarity. "If it pleases the king, let him send me to Judah. Give me letters to the governors of Transeuphrathenia, so that they will let me pass until I reach Judah, and a letter to the person in charge of the royal forest to provide me with wood." To Nehemiah's surprise, King Artaxerxes not only granted his request, but also gave him letters of authorization, resources, and a military escort to ensure his safety. Nehemiah immediately recognized that this response was not just the result of his skill, but of divine intervention. "Because the kind hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my request." Nehemiah 2 verse 8. Nehemiah's courage in approaching the king teaches us that faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act even in the face of uncertainty. Nehemiah knew his preparation and skills were important, but he fully trusted God to open the right doors. This moment in Nehemiah's story is a powerful reminder that even in the most difficult situations, God can intervene in surprising ways. Nehemiah was not just courageous. He was strategic, respectful, and dependent on God. After receiving permission from King Artaxerxes and gathering the necessary resources, Nehemiah left for Jerusalem. This journey, although physical, also marked the beginning of his mission as God's chosen leader to restore the city of his ancestors. Arriving in Jerusalem was just the beginning. Nehemiah knew that he would have to face practical and spiritual challenges to fulfill his task. Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem without fanfare, choosing to keep his initial purpose a secret. Nehemiah 2 verses 11-12 describes his arrival. "I arrived in Jerusalem, and after 3 days I left at night with some of my companions. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem." This strategic approach demonstrates Nehemiah's prudence. He knew it was important to assess the situation for himself before making his plans known. This avoided premature resistance and gave him time to understand the magnitude of the challenge. Nehemiah chose the night to inspect the city walls. The darkness provided stealth, allowing him to perform careful analysis without attracting unwanted attention. The Bible reports that Nehemiah, accompanied only by a few trusted men, rode around the city on an animal, observing the gaps and ruins of the walls. "At night I went out through the valley gate, towards the dragon fountain and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been torn down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire." Nehemiah 2 verse 13. This act symbolizes more than a simple structural assessment. It represents Nehemiah's commitment to the cause, facing the reality of what needed to be done. After the inspection, Nehemiah began to formulate a plan. He knew that reconstruction would not only be a physical effort, but also a fight against disunity among the Jews, external opposition, and a lack of resources. He organized his ideas in a practical way, focusing on mobilizing the entire Jerusalem community for the task. Nehemiah teaches us an important lesson. Before acting, it is essential to fully understand the challenge. He did not begin his mission with speeches or promises, but with a thorough examination of the situation. This strategic silence allowed him to prepare a well-reasoned approach to motivate the people and confront the opposition. Nehemiah's arrival in Jerusalem marks the beginning of his active leadership. He showed that effective leaders are those who observe, plan, and act at the right time. Nehemiah combined his faith with careful planning, trusting God to guide him in his next steps. Once Nehemiah began rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, he faced fierce opposition and challenges from within and without. His determination and leadership were put to the test by those who did not wish to see the city rise again. In this topic, we explore how Nehemiah dealt with these difficulties, keeping the work moving forward and the people united. Soon after Reconstruction began, opponents led by Sanballat, Tobias, and Geshem emerged. These local leaders feared that the restoration of Jerusalem would threaten their own influence in the region. Initially, they ridiculed Nehemiah and the workers, trying to demoralize them. What are these weak Jews doing? Will they restore what was destroyed? Will they sacrifice? Will it be over in one day? Can they bring stones back to life from heaps of rubble, from burnt stones? Nehemiah 4 verse 2. When they realized that the insults had no effect, opponents began to conspire against the work, planning physical attacks to interrupt the reconstruction. Nehemiah responded in a practical and spiritual way, organizing the workers into shifts of vigilance and prayer. We prayed to our God and posted guards to protect us against them day and night. Nehemiah 4 verse 9. While dealing with external threats, Nehemiah also faced internal problems. The people were discouraged due to the magnitude of the work and physical exhaustion. The workers' strength is running out, and there is still a lot of rubble. We won't be able to rebuild the wall. Nehemiah 4 verse 10. Additionally, there were social and economic tensions among Jews, such as financial exploitation and inequalities. Nehemiah confronted these injustices directly, reprimanding leaders who charged abusive interest and ordering restitution to the poorest. You are exploiting your own countrymen. Give them back today the fields, the vineyards, the olive trees, and the houses, and also the interest they charged them. Nehemiah 5 verses 7 and 11. Nehemiah showed strategic leadership by combining defense and work. He armed the workers and organized shifts to ensure that half of them built while the other half watched. With one hand, they did the work, and with the other, they held a weapon. Nehemiah 4 verse 17. This approach reinforced the people's morale, showing that divine protection was complemented by practical action and constant vigilance. Nehemiah also maintained the spiritual focus of the work. He continually encouraged the people to trust in God and to remember that reconstruction was a divine calling. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, for your sons and daughters, for your wives, and for your homes. Nehemiah 4 verse 14. This combination of spirituality and practical strategy ensured that workers did not lose faith, even in the most difficult times. Nehemiah teaches us that true leadership emerges in times of crisis. He faced difficulties with courage, faith, and well-planned strategies, showing that an effective leader must be resilient and motivating. With the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls nearly complete, Nehemiah understood that the physical restoration of the city was only part of the task. Jerusalem's survival and prosperity also depended on spiritual and social transformation. Nehemiah took decisive action to address inequalities, restore justice, and renew the people's commitment to God. During Reconstruction, Nehemiah discovered that poorer Jews were being exploited by their rich countrymen. There were people who, because of debt, were losing their land, homes, and even selling their children into slavery. Nehemiah confronted this practice with indignation, calling the community to a public assembly. "What you are doing is not right. They must walk in the fear of our God to avoid the mockery of the nations, our enemies." Nehemiah 5 verse 9. He ordered the return of land and property and the suspension of interest charges. Today, give them back their fields, vineyards, olive trees, and houses, as well as the interest they charged. Nehemiah 5 verse 11. The leaders and rich people obeyed, showing the impact of Nehemiah's firm and ethical leadership. Nehemiah knew that Reconstruction would not be complete without spiritual renewal. He summoned Ezra, the scribe, to lead the public reading of the scriptures before the entire community. Ezra opened the book. Everyone could see him, for he was in a high place. And as soon as he opened it, all the people stood up. Nehemiah 8 verse 5. The reading of God's law was accompanied by explanations to ensure that everyone understood. This had a profound spiritual impact, causing people to cry as they recognized their failures. Nehemiah, however, encouraged them to celebrate. "This day is consecrated to our Lord. Do not be sad, for the joy of the Lord will strengthen you." Nehemiah 8 verse 10. After reading the scriptures, the people renewed their commitment to God through a pact. They promised to follow the commandments, observe the Sabbath, and avoid intermarriage with neighboring nations that could lead them away from the faith. Nehemiah also restored tithing and organized priests and Levites to ensure continued temple worship. Nehemiah led with integrity, refusing personal benefits, even as governor. He dedicated himself to serving the people and honoring God, setting a standard for ethical and selfless leadership. "I didn't act like previous governors. On the contrary, I dedicated myself to working on the wall." Nehemiah 5 verses 15 to 16. Nehemiah understood that a city is not supported by walls alone, but by a united, fair, and spiritually strengthened people. His social and spiritual reforms transformed Jerusalem into a community that reflected God's values. In the next topic, we will see how Nehemiah successfully completed his mission and left a lasting legacy of faith and leadership. After facing a series of external and internal challenges, Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem completed the reconstruction of the city walls in record time. This achievement, more than a structural victory, was a symbol of renewal of faith, identity, and collective strength of the Jewish people. With perseverance and joint work, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt in just 52 days. So we finished the wall on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard of this, all the surrounding nations were terrified, and their pride was wounded, for they realized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Nehemiah 6 verses 15 to 16. The speed and success of the work made it clear that God's hand was on Nehemiah and the people. It was a powerful testimony to the nations around, showing that nothing can stop those who have faith and are determined to fulfill divine purpose. After the reconstruction was completed, Nehemiah organized a solemn ceremony to dedicate the walls. Two large choirs walked along the walls in opposite directions, singing praises to God. Nehemiah 12 verse 43 describes the moment of celebration. That day they offered many sacrifices. They rejoiced, for God had filled them with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the sounds of joy in Jerusalem could be heard from afar. This ceremony not only marked the completion of a physical work, but also symbolized the spiritual rebirth of Jerusalem as a city dedicated to the Lord. Nehemiah not only rebuilt the walls, but also the hearts of the people. He left a lasting legacy of leadership based on faith, justice, and determination. Through his social and spiritual reforms, Nehemiah established a united community committed to God and his principles. Even after the work was completed, Nehemiah remained vigilant. He continued to implement reforms to ensure that the worship of God was maintained, the Sabbath was observed, and justice prevailed in society. If you were inspired by the story of Nehemiah and want to discover more transformative narratives, subscribe to the channel right now. Leave your like, activate the bell, and share this video so that more people are impacted. Let's explore stories that strengthen faith together and courage.